They came for his blood on a Tuesday. 7 lords, 40 armed men. A sealed warrant bearing the royal crest that accused Duke Cassian Raventhorne of treason against the crown. They rode through the iron gates of Blackthorne Keep with torches held high and swords already drawn, expecting to find a man broken by isolation, weakened by years of ruling a frozen territory that the southern courts had long since forgotten. They found him standing alone in the courtyard. No guards flanking him. No armor. Just a black coat open against the northern wind and a gaze that made the horses pull backward before their riders could stop them. "You brought 40 men," Cassian said, his voice carrying across the stone like something dragged from deep underground. "That tells me you have already decided this ends with violence." He tilted his head, and the torchlight caught the scar that ran from his left temple to the corner of his jaw. "So let me save you the performance of reading that warrant." He stepped forward, just one step, and 2 of the mounted soldiers broke formation. Lord Aldrich Hessler, the man holding the warrant, felt his hand begin to shake. He had rehearsed this confrontation for weeks. He had convinced 6 other noble houses that the Duke of the North was a relic, a ghost story that southern children no longer believed. He had assured them that Cassian Raventhorne bled like any man. But standing in that courtyard, with the black towers of the keep rising behind the Duke like the spine of something ancient and patient, Aldrich understood something his ambition had blinded him to. The ghost story was standing 10 feet away. And it was not a story. What happened next would be whispered through the northern territories for years. And if you stay until the very end of this tale, you will understand why even kings learned to speak the name Raventhorne quietly. The bodies were cleared before dawn. Not all 40 men had fought. Some had thrown down their weapons the moment Cassian called his garrison from the walls. Others had tried to ride back through the gates and found them already sealed. The 7 lords themselves never drew steel. They knelt in the courtyard mud while their soldiers were disarmed, and they offered surrender with the desperate fluency of men who had suddenly remembered that politics was supposed to be conducted with words. Cassian granted them their lives, not out of mercy. Mercy was a currency he had stopped trading in years ago. He let them live because dead lords attracted royal investigators, and royal investigators attracted the kind of attention that interfered with the only thing Cassian cared about: absolute control over his domain. "Send them south with their horses and nothing else," he told Captain Edric Hale, the commander of his garrison, as the gray light of morning crept across the keep. "Their weapons stay. Their armor stays. Let them ride home in their underclothes. The humiliation will keep them quiet longer than fear." Edric, a thick-shouldered man who had served 3 generations of Raventhorns and buried 2 of them, studied the Duke's face for something human. He had been looking for 15 years. He had not found it yet. "And Lord Hessler?" Edric asked. Cassian was already walking toward the east tower, his boots striking the stone with the measured rhythm of a man who had not slept and did not intend to. "What about him?" "He will go to the crown. He will tell them you refused the warrant. He will tell them whatever makes him sound least pathetic. That is what men like Hessler do." Cassian paused at the base of the tower stairs. He did not turn around. "The crown sent that warrant because someone at court wants to test whether I still bite. Now they have their answer. Let them decide what to do with it." Edric watched him disappear into the stairwell, and he felt the thing he always felt in the Duke's wake. Not fear exactly, though fear was part of it. Something closer to grief. The boy he had watched grow up inside these walls, the boy who had once chased ravens across the northern moors and laughed when they landed on his shoulders, that boy had died the same night his father did. What walked the corridors of Blackthorne Keep now was something else entirely. Something that had learned to survive by becoming the thing that others survived against. The East Tower study had not changed in 15 years. The same oak desk scarred with blade marks from Cassian's father, who had conducted negotiations with a hunting knife always in hand. The same maps of the northern territories pinned to the walls with iron nails. The same window that looked out over the cliffs, where the sea threw itself against the rocks 300 feet below, endlessly, stupidly, as though it believed that one day the stone would give. Cassian stood at that window now, watching the gray water churn. His knuckles were split from the courtyard. He had not noticed until now. The blood had dried in thin, dark lines across his hands, and he studied them the way a craftsman studies the wear on his tools. Functional damage. nothing that would slow him. He poured whiskey into a glass that had not been washed in days and drank it standing. He did not sit. Sitting invited thought, and thought invited memory, and memory was the one enemy he had never learned to defeat. His father's face, the sound of the blade, the way the candles had guttered in the draught from the open door, and how Cassian, 14 years old, had stood in the hallway outside his father's chambers and listened to the old Duke die and done nothing, because the men who killed him had told him that if he moved, they would kill his mother too. And he had believed them because he was 14 and he did not yet understand that they had already killed her 3 rooms away. He finished the whiskey, set the glass down with a sound like a verdict. That was 15 years ago. He had spent every day since then making certain that no one would ever hold that kind of power over him again, not through walls or armies or alliances, through the simple, brutal arithmetic of making the cost of threatening him higher than anyone was willing to pay. It had worked. For 15 years, it had worked. The knock on the study door came at mid-morning. Edric again, but this time his face carried something Cassian had not seen there in years. Confusion. "There is a woman at the gate," Edric said. "There are many women at the gate. The kitchen staff returns from market on Tuesdays." "This one is not kitchen staff." Edric hesitated, which was itself remarkable. Edric Hale did not hesitate. He had pulled arrows from his own leg without flinching. "She says she carries a royal decree. She says she has been promised to you." Cassian turned from the window slowly. The light caught the scar again, and Edric saw what he always saw in that turn. The calculation. The instant, machine-precise assessment of threat and opportunity that had replaced instinct in the Duke's mind. "Promised," Cassian repeated. "Her word, not mine." "Bring her to the Great Hall. Search her escort." "She has no escort." The calculation shifted. Edric could almost hear it the way you could hear a lock turning inside a door. A woman alone carrying a royal decree, claiming betrothal to the most dangerous nobleman in the Northern Territories. Either she was a weapon sent by his enemies, or she was insane. Cassian found both possibilities equally interesting. "Bring her to the Great Hall," he said again. "And Edric, do not search her. If she is carrying something meant to kill me, I want to see how she tries." The Great Hall of Blackthorne Keep had been built for intimidation. 60 feet of vaulted stone, iron chandeliers that hung from chains thick enough to anchor ships, a raised platform at the far end where the Duke's chair sat beneath a mounted display of ancestral weapons, each one used in actual combat, each one still sharp enough to draw blood. Cassian was sitting in that chair when they brought her in. He had positioned himself deliberately, the full weight of the hall's architecture pressing down on anyone who walked its length toward him. He had watched powerful men stumble under that weight. He had watched ambassadors lose their rehearsed speeches halfway across the floor. Lady Seraphina Vale did not stumble. She walked the length of the great hall the way a person walks through their own home, with the unconscious authority of someone who has never questioned their right to occupy space. She was not tall. She was not armed. She wore a traveling cloak the color of charcoal, mud-stained at the hem, and her dark hair was pulled back from a face that showed every mile of the road she had traveled to reach him. She looked exhausted and underfed and completely, inexplicably unafraid. She stopped at the base of the platform and looked up at him the way one looks at a locked door. Not with fear, with assessment. "You are smaller than the stories suggest," she said. Edric, standing near the hall's entrance, closed his eyes. Cassian did not move. He remained precisely as he was, one hand on the arm of his chair, the other resting against the side of his jaw, his body arranged in the geometry of absolute stillness that he had learned made other people fill silence with their own mistakes. Seraphina did not fill the silence. She stood in it comfortably, as though she had been living inside difficult silences her entire life and had long since stopped finding them threatening. 10 seconds passed. 15. "The decree," Cassian said finally. She produced it from inside her cloak, a rolled parchment sealed with the royal crest, identical in appearance to the warrant Lord Hessler had carried the night before. She held it out, and when no one moved to take it, she walked up the 3 steps of the platform and placed it directly on the arm of his chair, close enough that her fingers nearly brushed his. He watched her hand, steady, no tremor. Either she had extraordinary nerve or she had already decided that whatever happened next was acceptable. He broke the seal and read. The decree was brief. It stated that Lady Seraphina Vale, daughter of the late Lord Marcus Vale of Ashenmoor, had been promised in marriage to Duke Cassian Raventhorne as part of a territorial agreement negotiated before Lord Vale's death. It bore the royal seal, 2 witness signatures, and a date that placed the agreement 3 years in the past. It was, Cassian recognized immediately, a forgery, an exceptional one. The seal was genuine, likely stolen. The witness signatures belonged to men who were conveniently dead, and the territorial agreement it referenced had never existed. He looked up from the parchment. She was still standing on the platform, 3 feet from him, watching his face the way a chess player watches the board after making a move they cannot take back. "You know this is forged," he said. It was not a question. He wanted to see what she would do with the accusation. Something shifted behind her eyes. Not panic, not even surprise. A recalibration. Like a sailor adjusting to a wind that had changed direction faster than expected. "Does it matter?" she said. "You walk into my keep with a fabricated document claiming rights to my name and my title, and you ask me if it matters. I ask you if it matters because you and I both know that the authenticity of that paper is not what will decide what happens next." She held his gaze without flinching. "What will decide it is whether you find me more useful alive and inside these walls than dead and outside them." Edric, still standing near the entrance, felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. He had watched men negotiate with Cassian Raventhorne. He had watched them plead. He had watched them threaten. He had never watched someone walk directly into the center of the Duke's power and speak to him as though they were standing on equal ground. Cassian set the forged decree on the arm of his chair. He did not tear it. He did not throw it. He set it down carefully, the way one handles evidence that may become useful. "You have 60 seconds to explain why I should not have you thrown from the cliffs," he said. "I advise you to be specific." Seraphina did not rush. That was the thing he would remember later, when the events of the coming months had reshaped everything he understood about power and vulnerability and the thin, brutal border between them. She did not rush. "Your father was murdered by men inside his own house," she said. "You survived by becoming something no one could touch. It worked. You are untouchable. You are also completely alone. And the Southern courts know it. They sent that warrant last night not because they believed the treason charge. They sent it to see if anyone inside Blackthorne would open the gates for them." She paused. "No one did. But the fact that they thought someone might tells you everything about how fragile your position actually is." "You know about the warrant. I passed Lord Hessler and his men on the Southern Road this morning. They were riding in their underclothes. It was not difficult to piece together what had happened." Cassian stood. The movement was sudden enough that Edric's hand went to his sword. Seraphina did not step back. She tilted her head slightly to maintain eye contact as he rose to his full height above her, and there was something in that small adjustment, that refusal to yield even an inch of psychological ground, that struck him like a physical blow. "What do you want?" he said. "Not asking, demanding. Safety," she said. "My father's estate was seized after his death. The men who took it want me silent or dead, and they have the resources to achieve either. I need a name powerful enough to make them reconsider. Yours is the only one that qualifies. And in return? In return, you get something you cannot purchase with money or fear. A presence inside these walls that changes how the court perceives you. Right now, they see a man alone in a fortress. Alone means vulnerable. Alone means there is no one whose loss could be used against you, which sounds like strength until you realize it also means there is no one whose presence legitimizes your claim to anything beyond brute force." She took a breath. "A duchess changes the calculus. A duchess means dynasty, means continuity, means the Northern Territories are not a warlord's camp, but a house with a future." The silence that followed was not like the silence before. That had been a contest. This was something else. This was the sound of a man encountering an argument he could not immediately dismantle, and the unfamiliar, almost physical disorientation of not knowing whether that made him angry or fascinated. "Edric," Cassian said without looking away from her, "prepare the East Corridor guest chambers." "My lord? You heard me? The East Corridor has been closed for—" "I know how long it has been closed. Open it. Have the fireplaces cleared and lit. She stays." Seraphina released a breath she had been holding, and in that single exhale, Cassian saw it. The crack in the armor, the exhaustion and the fear and the desperate, iron-willed refusal to let either of those things show. She was not fearless. She was terrified. She had simply decided that terror was not a sufficient reason to stop. He filed that information away the way he filed everything. As a weapon, as a vulnerability, as something that might, under the right pressure, be used. He did not yet understand that he had just allowed something through the gates of Blackthorne Keep that no wall could contain. That the woman standing before him, forged decree in her hand and nowhere left to run, was not a political tool to be managed. She was the detonation point of everything he had built, and the fuse had already been lit. Late that night, after the East Corridor fires had been burning for hours, and the servants had whispered themselves into silence about the woman who had walked into the Duke's hall and walked out again alive, Cassian stood alone in his study, holding the forged decree up to the candlelight, studying the stolen seal, the dead men's signatures, the careful, desperate craftsmanship of a lie built by someone with nothing left to lose. He set it down, poured whiskey, drank. Somewhere in the East Corridor a door opened and closed, and for the first time in 15 years Blackthorne Keep held a sound that its stones had forgotten, the footsteps of someone who was not afraid to walk its halls in the dark. Cassian listened. He did not sleep. At dawn, a rider arrived from the southern capital carrying a second sealed message. Not a warrant this time. A summons. The Crown was commanding Duke Cassian Raventhorne to present himself at the Winter Sovereign Ball in 60 days, where he would answer publicly for the events of the previous night. But it was the final line of the summons that made Cassian set down his glass and stand very still. You are commanded to present your household in full, including any recently acquired members. Someone at court already knew about Seraphina. Someone had sent her here, and Cassian Raventhorne, who had not been outmaneuvered in 15 years, felt something he had almost forgotten existed. Uncertainty. The summons sat on the oak desk like a blade that had already been thrown. Cassian read it 3 more times. Not because the words changed, but because he was looking for the seam. Every trap had one. Every manufactured scenario, every political ambush dressed as bureaucratic procedure had a point where the design showed through. He had spent 15 years finding those seams before they could be used against him, and he had never yet been wrong about the presence of one. Someone at court already knew about Seraphina, which meant either the men who wanted her dead had reached inside the royal household, or the people who had sent her here had positioned her deliberately, using Blackthorne Keep as a staging ground for something Cassian could not yet fully see. Both possibilities pointed toward the same conclusion. He was standing inside someone else's architecture, and he had not noticed the walls going up around him until they were already complete. He folded the summons, placed it beneath the forged decree, put both documents inside the locked drawer of his desk, which contained 11 other documents that had the potential to destroy powerful men if deployed correctly, and sat back in his chair. The candle on the desk had burned down to its last inch. Outside, the northern cliffs were catching the first gray light, and the sea below them was the color of cold iron. Cassian watched it and felt the thing he always felt when the shape of an enemy's strategy became visible. Not fear. Something colder. The specific, clarifying recognition that the rules of the situation had just changed, and that he was the only one in the room who knew it yet. He needed to speak to her. He needed to speak to her before she had time to build more defenses, because the exhaustion she had nearly hidden the night before was the only gap he was likely to get, and he had not survived 15 years of political warfare by ignoring the gaps. He found her in the East Corridor at a window, watching the same sea he had just been watching. She was still dressed from the night before, which told him she had not slept, which told him her composure in the great hall had cost her more than she had let show. There was a cup of tea on the windowsill beside her that had gone cold. She had not drunk it. She was thinking, and she was thinking hard, and she did not hear him coming until he was close enough that turning to face him required a physical adjustment that she made deliberately, with the measured control of someone refusing to appear startled. "You read the summons," she said. It was not a question. She had heard the rider arrive. She had probably been standing at this window calculating her position from the moment the gate opened. That told him something significant. She had anticipated a response from the court. She had been waiting for it. "You're going to tell me," Cassian said, "who sent you here." "I told you who sent me here, my own survival instinct." "Try again." She turned to face him fully then, and in the gray morning light without the performance of the previous evening, he could see the real shape of her face. The shadows under her eyes were deep. There was a tension in the set of her jaw that she was maintaining through will rather than composure. She had the face of someone who had been running for a long time and had stopped only because she had reached the edge of the map. "I came here because it was the only logical destination," she said. "Not because someone directed me. Because when you eliminate every other option, whatever remains is the answer." And everyone else was eliminated. Yes. Who did the eliminating? She held his gaze. Something moved behind her eyes. Not evasion. The specific hesitation of a person deciding how much of a dangerous truth to release at once. "Lord Brennan Voss," she said. Cassian knew the name. Brennan Voss was a Southern court fixture, a man whose power derived entirely from proximity to the crown and the careful management of information. He controlled 3 seats on the Territorial Council, held financial interest in half the trade routes between the capital and the eastern ports, and had survived 4 royal administrations by being precisely useful enough to keep and precisely forgettable enough to never threaten. He was the kind of man Cassian had always classified as background noise, the kind of man you did not look at directly because there appeared to be nothing worth looking at. "Voss seized my father's estate," Serafina said. "He manufactured the debt claim that justified it. 2 of the witnesses who could have refuted the claim died within a month of the seizure. The 3rd was paid well enough to relocate to the continent and develop amnesia." She picked up the cold tea, looked at it, set it back down. "I have documented proof of the manufactured debt. 3 letters in Voss's own hand, specific enough to destroy him if they reach the right people. Where are the letters?" "Safe." "That is not an answer. It is the only answer you are getting until I know whether you are going to help me or sell me to the first man who makes you a better offer." She said it without heat, flatly. The way a person states a mathematical reality they have accepted even though it is not in their favor. Cassian studied her face for a long moment. She did not look away. He had perfected the weight of a sustained stare as a weapon, had watched it reduce men to stuttering justifications, and she sat inside it with the stillness of something that had already decided it would not be moved. "Voss has a seat on the Territorial Council," he said. "Yes. If those letters exist and they contain what you say they contain, they are worth considerably more than the safety of 1 woman." "I know, which means you came here not only to survive. You came here to use me." The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, the ghost of one. "You came here to use yourself. I simply gave you a reason to look in the right direction." Edric appeared at the end of the corridor, and whatever might have come next died in the sudden competence that replaced everything else in Cassian's face when his captain needed his attention. "The servants are talking," Edric said. Not apologetically, as a report. "About the woman, about the decree, about what happened in the hall last night." He paused. "Word will reach the village by noon. From the village it moves to the southern roads within 2 days." "Let it move," Cassian said. "My lord, if the court summons want me to arrive at the winter ball with my household in full, then my household needs to exist. Let them talk. Let the roads carry it. By the time we reach the capital, the story should be settled enough to be inconvenient for anyone who wants to challenge it." Edric looked at Serafina. Serafina looked back at him with the patient courtesy of someone who had learned not to treat skepticism as an insult. "The East Corridor fires held through the night," Edric said finally, which was the closest thing to a welcome he appeared capable of. "Thank you," she said. He left. His footsteps down the stone corridor had the rhythm of a man deeply unsettled but too professional to show it through anything except the pace of his retreat. Cassian looked at Serafina again. She was watching him with the particular attention of a person trying to map a territory they have just committed to crossing. "The ball is in 60 days, he said. "I know. You cannot walk into the Winter Sovereign Ball as a woman with a forged decree and stolen letters. You walk in as my Duchess, or you do not walk in at all, and if you do not walk in at all, Voss sees you exposed and acts before I can use what you are carrying against him." "I understand the calculation." "Then you understand that what you proposed last night is no longer a proposal. It is the only workable strategy, and we have 60 days to make it credible." He paused, and the pause had the specific texture of something being decided. which means you start talking, not careful, measured half-truths. Everything. Voss, the letters, what he wants from the crown, who else is involved, what you know about the people who wrote that summons. All of it. She was quiet for a moment. The light through the corridor window had shifted, the sea below catching the first actual color of morning, and it crossed her face in a way that made her look younger than she had in the great hall, more tired, more real. "All right," she said. "Now. Give me an hour. I need to eat something. I haven't eaten since yesterday morning, and I think better when I'm not considering whether to start on the upholstery." Something happened in his chest that he did not catalog and refused to examine. He turned away from it the way he turned away from all irrelevant data, efficiently, without looking directly at it. "Edric will have food brought to the study," he said, and walked back down the corridor before the situation could develop any further texture. She talked for 4 hours, not the careful, rationed version of events she had offered the night before. The real account. It came out in the measured, sequential way of a person who has rehearsed the telling because they understand that how a story is told determines how it is understood, and Seraphina Vale had clearly thought very carefully about how her story needed to be understood. Her father, Lord Marcus Vale, had been a minor northern lord of the third tier, not powerful enough to threaten anyone, wealthy enough to be useful. He had held a piece of land that sat precisely at the junction of 2 trade routes that Brennan Voss had been slowly acquiring for 7 years, assembling a network of territory that, once completed, would give him practical control over the movement of goods between the capital and the eastern coast without requiring any official title to do so. The kind of power that operated entirely beneath the level where scrutiny could reach it. Marcus Vale had refused to sell. 3 times. The third refusal had apparently been accompanied by evidence that Voss had been bribing territorial surveyors to misrepresent land values across the northern provinces. And Marcus had made the mistake of putting that evidence in letters that he sent to 3 people he considered allies. Within 6 months, Marcus Vale was dead of what was recorded as a winter fever. His estate was seized to cover debts that Voss had manufactured with the cooperation of 2 council members and a royal clerk who had since been promoted to a position with considerably more access to sensitive documentation. Seraphina had been permitted to take her personal effects and leave. She had taken her personal effects, and the 3 letters her father had not known she had copied. "Why did you copy them?" Cassian said. They were sitting across from each other at the oak desk, the remains of the food between them, the morning now fully established outside the window. He had not interrupted her once during the 4 hours. He had listened the way he always listened, without reaction, filing everything. "Because my father trusted people he should not have trusted," she said. "He believed that evidence was sufficient, that if you had proof of wrongdoing, the wrongdoing would be addressed. I was 22, and I had just watched my mother die, and I already knew that the world did not actually operate that way. Evidence is only useful if you control who sees it and when." "Where are the letters?" She looked at him across the desk, and he saw her making the final calculation, the last threshold. She had come this far, had put herself inside his walls and inside his strategy, and the letters were the last thing she was holding that was entirely her own. "Hidden in a location I will tell you when I am certain you cannot use them to reach a separate arrangement with Voss before we reach the capital," she said. He should have found that maddening. He had spent the better part of 30 years finding that kind of withholding maddening, and he had developed a comprehensive set of methods for addressing it. But he sat with it for a moment, and what he felt was not the familiar cold frustration of power being challenged. What he felt was something he had last felt a very long time ago, in a life he had dismantled piece by piece. He felt that he was in a room with someone who thought at his speed. He did not let it show. He was excellent at not letting things show. But the recognition sat somewhere beneath his sternum for the rest of the morning. 60 days, he said. We will need a story that can be verified. Staff who can corroborate a timeline. An account of the betrothal agreement that does not require anyone to look too closely at the seal on that decree. I have considered the timeline, she said. Your father's negotiations with mine did occur. They were not marriage negotiations, but they were negotiations. The correspondence exists. We can work from what was real and add what is necessary. You researched my father's history. I researched everything about you that I could access from the outside. She said it without apology. I knew before I walked through your gate that the forged decree would not hold under examination. I knew I needed something real to anchor it to. Your father met with mine twice in the year before your father was killed. I found the record in the territorial archive. He was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that had different textures depending on what was living inside it. This one had the texture of reassessment, of standing at the edge of a revised map and acknowledging that the territory was larger than the previous version had suggested. You are either the most resourceful person I have allowed through these gates, he said, or the most dangerous. Those are not mutually exclusive. The days that followed were unlike anything Blackthorne Keep had experienced in 15 years. Cassian drove them at a pace that left no room for anything except the work. He was building a fiction that needed to be indistinguishable from truth, which meant the construction had to be architectural in its precision, every detail load-bearing, every account consistent with every other account. He had done this kind of work before, had constructed political realities from raw strategy, but he had never done it with a collaborator, and Serafina proved to be a collaborator of a specific and unsettling quality. She did not defer. That was the first thing he noticed. He would establish a framework, and she would examine it, and when she found a weakness, she would name it directly, without the hedging or the performance of deference that every other person in Blackthorne Keep had learned to deploy around him. The first time she told him that his proposed timeline for the betrothal correspondence had a gap that a competent investigator would locate in under an hour, he experienced a specific, involuntary second of something that he chose to classify as professional irritation and moved on. She was right. She was right several times in the first week, and each time she was right, he felt the irritation and the other thing underneath it that he was not examining, and he adjusted the strategy and they moved forward. She moved through the keep with the same quality she had walked into the Great Hall with. Not ownership, something subtler. The unconscious ease of someone who decides that wherever they are is a place they have the right to be. The servants noticed. Edric noticed. The two housekeeping women who had maintained the East Corridor in quiet, efficient silence for years began to linger near the rooms where Serafina spent her mornings, drawn by something Cassian could not quantify and therefore found faintly dangerous. On the 9th day, she found the portrait. It hung in a corridor off the west wing that had been kept shuttered since the night of his father's murder. Cassian had not ordered it sealed. He had simply never ordered it opened, and the staff had drawn the logical conclusion. The shutters had kept the dust out, and the portrait had survived the years intact. His father's face, painted in the year before he died. Younger than Cassian was now, but recognizable in the set of the shoulders, the angle of the jaw. Cassian found Serafina standing in front of it with a candle she had brought from the corridor, studying the face with the focused attention she gave to everything that required understanding. "He looks like someone who expected to be challenged," she said, without turning around. Cassian stood in the doorway. He had not been in this corridor in 15 years. The air had the specific quality of sealed spaces, contained and dense, carrying the ghost of fires that had not been lit in a decade and a half. "He was," Cassian said. "You are angry at him." The words landed with the directness of something thrown rather than spoken. He felt his jaw tighten. "You do not know what I am. You haven't changed this corridor. You haven't removed the portrait. You haven't ordered this wing cleaned or opened or modified in any way. You have left it exactly as it was." She turned from the portrait to look at him. The candlelight moved with her, and her face was all contrast, the warm yellow light on one side, deep shadow on the other. "That is not grief. Grief does something. Rage leaves things exactly in place." "Put the candle back." "I am not afraid of your voice when it does that." "You should be." "Probably." She held his gaze without flinching. "I think you blame him for dying. I think some part of you has never forgiven him for leaving you alone in a castle full of the men who killed him and expecting you to manage it." She paused. "I think you became what you are not entirely by choice." The silence that followed was the most dangerous one that had occurred in Blackthorne Keep in 15 years. Cassian could feel his own heartbeat in a way he did not usually feel it. Slow, controlled, but present, which it often was not. He had learned to make it absent, to operate in the space below the register where the body reminded the mind of its own exposure. "You are going to walk out of this corridor," he said. "You're going to go back to the East Wing. And you are going to remember that what I choose to leave unexamined is not an invitation for examination." "Noted," she said. She walked past him toward the corridor door, and when she passed him close enough that he could have touched her if he had reached out, he smelled the cold air of the room on her hair and the soap she had used from the East Wing washroom, and he stood very still and did not move and did not reach. She paused at the door, did not turn around. "He looks proud," she said. "In the portrait, he looks like a man who thought the world would behave according to his expectations." A beat. "You learned not to expect that. It cost you something." She left. Cassian stood in the dark corridor for a long time, not looking at the portrait, looking at the place where she had been standing. The sessions in the study became longer. They built the story layer by layer, and somewhere in the building the sessions stopped being entirely about strategy and became something else. Not softer. He did not become softer, but the calculation shifted. He began to notice things he had not planned to notice. The way she moved her hands when she was thinking through a problem, rapid small gestures that she appeared unaware of. The way she went very still when she was lying and very mobile when she was being truthful, which was the opposite of how most people operated and told him something specific about where she had learned to be careful. The way she held eye contact longer than necessary at the end of an argument, not to press the advantage but to make sure the conversation was finished, as though she had learned to be certain of endings because she had been surprised by them too many times. He cataloged all of it. He told himself this was strategy. He was building a picture of a person he needed to understand in order to survive the next 60 days. This was what he did. He understood people well enough to predict them, and then he predicted them, and the prediction was always accurate, and the accuracy kept him alive. He was aware that this particular telling was not entirely clean. On the 22nd day, a writer arrived from the capital with a letter that was not from the crown. It was from Lord Brennan Voss himself. Cassian opened it alone, read it, and went very still in the way that in him meant something significant was happening beneath the surface. The letter was cordial. Voss wrote the way men wrote when they wanted to convey a threat through the architecture of pleasantry. He expressed his pleasure at the news of the Duke's upcoming appearance at the winter ball. He offered his congratulations on the Duke's apparent household addition. He noted, with what he described as gentle concern, that there were certain complicated questions surrounding the late Lord Vale's estate that he hoped would not create unnecessary difficulties for anyone involved. The last line read, "It would be a shame for complications to arise at such a public occasion. I trust we are men of sufficient understanding to prevent that outcome." Cassian set the letter down. He stood at his desk for 1 full minute without moving. Then he called for Edric, and when Edric came, he handed him the letter. Edric read it. His face did the thing it did when he was angry and controlling it. He knows she's here. He has known since the morning after she arrived. He has spent 3 weeks deciding whether to move openly or through suggestion. Cassian looked at the window. The sea below the cliffs was gray and heavy and continuous. He chose suggestion, which means he does not want a direct confrontation. He wants compliance. He wants her delivered back to whatever fate he had arranged for her, and he wants me to do it quietly in exchange for not using his counsel influence to complicate our position at court.
Are you going to tell her?
Yes. She will. I know what she will do. He had spent 22 days learning exactly what she would do, and the precision of that knowledge settled into his chest with a weight he was not certain how to classify. Tell the stable to rotate the watch. Nobody enters through the eastern gate without my personal clearance. And find out who in the capital has been feeding Voss information about the keep's internal movements. Edric left with the letter, and the expression of a man who had been carrying a bad premonition for weeks, and had just watched it arrive. Cassian knocked on the door of the east corridor room an hour later. Serafina opened it. She was dressed, working, papers on the table behind her. She read his face in the first half-second and stepped back from the door without asking permission. He came inside, told her about the letter without embellishment, watched her face as he spoke. She did not go pale. She did not reach for the table to steady herself. She stood in the center of the room and listened, and when he finished, the only thing that changed in her was her breathing. It went very deliberate. 1 breath in, 1 breath out. A person recalibrating themselves against a reality they had always known was coming, but had still hoped might hold off a little longer. He is going to move before the ball, she said. Yes, That means the letters need to be deployed before we reach the capital, not at the ball. Here. Here puts them in my hands, which is what I originally wanted. She looked at him for a long moment. The room was warm, the East Corridor fires burning the way they had burned every night for 3 weeks, and in the warm light she had a quality that the Great Hall had not contained. Something stripped down, something that was the actual person rather than the performance of the person. If I give you the letters before we reach the capital, she said slowly, I lose my leverage. You can reach an arrangement with Voss using what I've given you. Cut me out of it. Give him something less damaging than full exposure in exchange for something you want. Yes, he said. I could do that. But you are telling me about this letter. You are standing in my room telling me Voss has moved, which means you had the option to deal with this privately, and you did not take it. The silence between them changed. It went from the operational quality of 2 people solving a problem together to something that did not have an operational quality at all. You are not a political tool I can afford to discard, he said. It was the version of the truth that fit within the architecture of strategy and ambition and the specific, logical reason 2 people form an alliance. It was true. It was also not the complete truth, and somewhere in the 22 days of building something in these rooms, the space between the complete truth and the manageable version of it had grown large enough that standing in it was uncomfortable. She looked at him. She was very good at looking at people, at not flinching away from what she found there. All right, she said quietly. I'll tell you where the letters are. She crossed to the window, reached behind the shutter hinge where someone who had not spent 22 days noticing exactly how she moved through a room would never have thought to look. She pulled out a folded packet of papers, sealed and weathered, and held them out to him. He took them. Their fingers did not touch, but the space between them in that moment carried the specific charge of something that had been building in the structure of the days, in the work and the arguments and the dark corridor and the portrait, and the moments where the calculation had become something warmer and more inconvenient, and neither of them moved to resolve it, and the charge sat in the air between them like an undetonated thing. Read them tonight, she said. Tomorrow we decide how to use them. Cassian walked back to his study with the letters and the thing in his chest that he was still not examining, and he sat at his desk under the last inch of a candle and opened the packet and began to read. He had read 4 pages when the study door burst open, and Edric came in with his sword already drawn, and his face carrying the expression Cassian had not seen in 15 years, the expression from the night everything had ended. There are men in the keep, Edric said, already inside. They came through the east gate while the watch was rotated. Cassian was on his feet before Edric finished speaking. How many? 6 that we've counted, possibly more. And Serafina. Edric's silence lasted exactly 1 second, but 1 second was enough. Cassian was already moving. He crossed the length of Blackthorne Keep at a dead run for the first time in 15 years, and somewhere in the east corridor, a door splintered open, and a woman's voice said nothing at all, which was far worse than screaming, because silence meant she was already past the point of calling for help. He hit the east corridor running and turned the corner and stopped. 4 men in unmarked black, one of them holding Serafina by the arm, close enough to the corridor window that the drop to the cliffs was visible through the glass behind her. She was not struggling. She was standing absolutely still, and her face was the controlled, expressionless surface of someone who has run out of viable options and is waiting to see if the situation produces one. The man holding her looked at Cassian and smiled, and in the smile was the message that Voss wanted delivered. You had your chance to do this quietly. Cassian looked at Serafina. She looked back at him. In her eyes, beneath the control and the stillness and the extraordinary, infuriating refusal to appear afraid, was something she had not shown him in 22 days of study sessions and arguments and corridors and portraits and everything that had been building in the space between 2 people who thought at the same speed. It was not a request. It was not helplessness. It was trust. And Duke Cassian Raventhorne, who had not trusted or been trusted in 15 years, who had built his entire survival on the understanding that trust was a liability that got people killed in their own houses, felt it hit him somewhere beneath all the architecture of discipline and control and cold strategic intelligence, felt it land in the place where the 14-year-old boy still lived in the dark, and understood in that moment with absolute devastating clarity that whatever this woman was to his strategy and his political survival and the 60-day plan they had built together, she was also something else, something he was not going to let them take. He looked at the man holding her. His voice, when he spoke, was the voice from the courtyard, the one that made horses pull backward before their riders could stop them. "You have 10 seconds to let go of her arm," he said. "After that, I stopped counting." He did not count to 10. He reached 3 before his body made the decision that his mind had already completed, and then the corridor became something that corridors were not designed to be. Cassian moved the way he had moved in the courtyard 2 weeks before the night everything changed, with the specific economical violence of a man who had trained for 15 years because training was the only thing that reliably displaced grief, and the 4 men in unmarked black discovered in rapid succession what it meant to have underestimated the distance between a man's reputation and his actual capacity. The first went down from a single strike to the throat. The second managed to draw his blade and got it halfway up before Cassian took it from him with a wrist rotation that snapped something in the process. The third came from the side and caught Cassian across the jaw with a closed fist, and Cassian took it without going down, turned into it, and used the momentum to put the man's head into the corridor wall with a sound that ended the discussion. The fourth was the one holding Serafina. He had pulled her back against the corridor window when the fighting started, and now he had a blade at her side, not her throat, which told Cassian that the orders were not to kill her here. Killing her here was too loud, too visible, too difficult to attribute to anything except Voss's reach inside the keep, and Voss wanted deniability. He wanted her moved, quietly, to somewhere that explanations became unnecessary. Cassian stopped. 3 men on the floor behind him. One standing with Serafina and a blade and the specific expression of a professional who has run the calculation and understands that his position has just become considerably more complicated than his employer described. "They sent 4, Cassian said. His breathing was controlled. His jaw was bleeding where the fist had connected. He was not touching it. "Voss told you 4 was enough." The man said nothing. "He told you I would negotiate, that I would weigh the political cost of a body in my corridor against whatever she was worth to me and make the sensible choice." Cassian took 1 step forward. The man pressed the blade tighter, and Serafina made no sound, but her eyes tracked to Cassian with the focused intensity of someone calculating angles. "Voss does not know me as well as he believes." "Stop moving," the man said. "No." Another step. "You are going to put that blade down and walk out of my keep and tell Brennan Voss that the next men he sends will not walk out at all. That is the only transaction available to you in the next 30 seconds. "I have orders." "You had orders. Your orders assumed 4 men were sufficient." Cassian's voice had the specific flatness of someone who has moved past the point where emotion is a useful instrument. "Look at your colleagues and revise your assumptions." The man looked. What he saw on the corridor floor revised his assumptions with the speed that visual evidence tends to revise things. The blade dropped 2 inches. Then, with the pragmatic survival instinct of someone who had correctly identified the limit of what he was being paid for, it dropped completely. Serafina moved away from the window the moment the contact broke. She moved toward Cassian without looking back at the man, and the man, reading every element of the situation with the accuracy that his profession required, turned and walked quickly toward the east gate. Edric appeared at the corridor's far end with 3 garrison soldiers. He took in the scene with the practiced eye of a man who had cleaned up after violence for 30 years. "The gate," Cassian said. "Sealed now. We found 2 more in the kitchen passage. Neither will be a concern. The one who just left. Do not stop him. Let him reach his horse." Cassian picked up the blade the man had dropped, turned it in his hands. The hilt was plain, unmarked, the kind of weapon purchased specifically to carry no attribution. Professional work. Voss's investment in this operation had been deliberate and significant, which meant his patience was running out. Let him carry the message back. Edric looked at Serafina. "My lady, are you—" "I'm fine," she said, and her voice was steady in the way that voices are steady when a person is holding themselves together with considerable conscious effort and has decided that falling apart is not an option available to them in this corridor at this moment. Cassian looked at her. Her face was composed. Her hands at her sides were not entirely still. He noticed that and filed it and said nothing about it. "Edric," he said, "triple the watch on every entrance. I want names on everyone who came through this gate in the last 72 hours. And I want to know who rotated the watch when those men came through." Edric's face did the thing it did. I will find out. Yes, Cassian said. You will. He walked Seraphina back to the East Wing himself. He did not offer her his arm. She did not ask for it. They walked the length of the keep in a silence that had the quality of two people processing separate but adjacent catastrophes. And at the door of her room, she stopped and turned and looked at him with the face of someone who had something to say and was deciding whether now was the moment for it. Thank you, she said. Don't. I'm going to say it regardless of whether you want to hear it. I protected an asset, he said. The words tasted like what they were. A version of the truth that fit inside the frame of strategy and calculation. A version that kept the architecture intact. Go inside. Lock the door. I will have Edric's wife posted outside until morning. She looked at him for a moment longer than the exchange required. Then she went inside. The lock turned. Cassian stood in the corridor and listened to the silence of the keep around him. And beneath the operational assessment of breach points and watch failures and Voss's accelerating timeline, beneath all of it, the thing he had felt in the corridor when she had looked at him with that particular trust was still present. Still sitting in the place beneath all the architecture. He walked back to his study. He picked up Voss's letters from where they had fallen during his exit. He sat down. He did not sleep. The name came to Edric by dawn. He brought it to the study without preamble, which was how Edric delivered information he did not want to be the person delivering. He set a single sheet of paper on the desk and stepped back and waited. Cassian read the name. The study was very quiet. Outside the window, the sea was the color of old pewter, and the light had the flat quality of a morning that had no interest in being dramatic. Everything important happened in flat light. Cassian had always known that. Drama was for events that required witnesses. The things that actually broke the shape of a life happened in ordinary light, with no audience at all. The name on the paper was Edric's second, a young garrison officer named Tom Hale. No relation to Edric by blood. Related by the 15 years Edric had spent treating him as a son, training him, advancing him, vouching for him inside the keep's hierarchy with the specific, unguarded generosity of a man who had believed completely in the person he was investing in. Tom Hale had rotated the watch. He had done it deliberately, at a time he knew would create the gap, and he had done it because someone had reached him. Not with threats. Edric's investigation had established that much in 4 hours. With money. With the promise of a position in the Southern Court. With everything that Blackthorne Keep could not offer a 24-year-old man who had grown up watching the North be systematically forgotten by everyone who held power in the kingdom. Cassian set the paper down. He looked at the wall. He thought about Edric's face when he had brought this report, the specific quality of controlled devastation in a man who had just discovered that the closest thing he had to family had been operating against everything he had spent his life protecting. He thought about what it meant that Voss had found Tom Hale, had assessed him, had identified the specific hunger and the specific resentment and the specific threshold at which loyalty became negotiable, had used exactly the right instrument in exactly the right place. Voss was not background noise. Voss had never been background noise. Cassian had classified him that way because Voss had wanted to be classified that way, had cultivated that precise quality of invisibility for years, and Cassian, who prided himself on seeing clearly, had looked in Voss's direction and seen exactly what Voss had constructed for him to see. He had been managed. The realization was cold and total and carried the specific weight of an error made not from ignorance but from the one vulnerability he had never fully armored. He had not looked closely enough at Voss because Voss had never appeared to be worth the attention, and the assumption of insignificance was the oldest trap in the architecture of power, and Cassian had walked into it with his eyes open. "Where is Tom now?" he said. "In the garrison holding room." Edric's voice was flat, the flatness of a man who has burned through every available emotion in 4 hours and come out the other side into something that functions like calm, but is not. "Does he know we have identified him?" "No." Cassian stood. He buttoned his coat. He picked up the paper with Tom's name on it and folded it once and put it in his pocket. "Come with me," he said. The garrison holding room was a stone space below the keep's east foundation, built for exactly this purpose. Tom Hale was sitting on the bench inside it. He was 24, and he had the face of someone who had not yet decided whether to be afraid, which meant he did not yet know why he had been brought here. He looked up when Cassian came through the door. He looked at Edric behind Cassian. Something moved across his face. Not guilt yet. Something that preceded guilt. The first crack in the wall of not knowing. Cassian sat down across from him and said nothing for a long time. Tom filled the silence the way most people filled Cassian's silences, with the nervous, automatic need to occupy the space. "My lord, I do not know why I have been—" "Stop," Cassian said. Tom stopped. "I'm going to tell you what I know," Cassian said, "and you're going to listen. And when I'm finished, you're going to make a decision. The decision you make will determine the rest of your life, and I want you to understand that I mean that in the most literal possible sense." He told Tom what they had found. No embellishment, no theater, just the sequence of established facts in the order they had been established. The watch rotation, the timing, the correspondence that Edric's people had located in Tom's quarters in the last hour. 2 letters from an intermediary in the southern capital that were careful enough to be deniable and specific enough to be damning. Tom listened. As the recitation continued, the crack in the wall of not knowing became something else entirely. His face went through 3 or 4 distinct phases that Cassian watched without expression, and by the end of it, the 24-year-old sitting across from him looked considerably older than he had when Cassian came through the door. "They told me she would just be taken back south," Tom said. His voice was rough. That nobody would be hurt. That it was a matter of an estate dispute and they just needed her away from the keep. "A man held a blade to her in my corridor." Tom's jaw worked. "I did not know." "You knew enough." Cassian leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees, his voice stripped of everything except the information he needed to convey. "You knew they were coming inside my walls. You knew they were coming for a woman under my protection. You chose to believe the version of events that made your choice comfortable, because the alternative required you to look at what you were actually doing." The silence that followed had a different quality than Cassian's usual silences. It was not a weapon. It was a space. And in the space, Tom Hale sat with the full weight of what he had done and what it had almost cost. And Cassian watched a young man learn something in real time that most people only learned after it was too late to matter. "Edric trusted you," Cassian said. Not loudly, quietly, which was worse. Something broke in Tom's face. Fully and completely, the way things break when the structural element finally gives rather than the surface. He did not cry. He sat with the break and did not look away from it, and that, Cassian decided, was the only thing in the room that functioned as mitigation. "What I do with you," Cassian said, "depends entirely on what you tell me about the intermediary. Name, location, every communication, every instruction, everything," Tom told him. It took 2 hours, and by the end of it, Cassian had the name of a Southern Court functionary 3 levels below Voss in the visible hierarchy, which was exactly where Voss would position an operative, and he had the location of 2 meetings and the substance of 3 additional conversations that extended the chain of Voss's operation significantly further than the original letters had suggested. Voss was not just clearing a land obstacle. He was building something. The northern trade route, the manufactured estate claims, the careful cultivation of informants inside noble households across the territories, it was an architecture. 15 years of it, patient, invisible, operating entirely beneath the threshold of scrutiny because Voss had understood something that Cassian was only now fully reckoning with. The most dangerous power was the power that no one thought to examine. He left Edric with Tom and walked back up through the keep to his study. He spread the letters on his desk. The 3 Serafina had given him, Voss's own correspondence, the new information from Tom's account. He looked at the full shape of it assembled in front of him, all the pieces in their actual positions rather than the positions he had assigned them based on incomplete assessment. He had been operating on a 30-day timeline toward the winter ball. That timeline was now irrelevant. Voss would not wait for the ball. Voss had already moved once and failure would not make him patient. It would make him accelerate. He had 40 days before the ball, and a man under pressure who had already demonstrated the willingness to reach inside Blackthorne Keep itself. The strategy he had built with Serafina was good. It was genuinely good work, careful and precise, and built on real foundations. But it had been designed for a controlled timeline, for a managed approach to the capital with the letters as a detonation device deployed at the precise moment of maximum impact. That controlled timeline no longer existed. He needed a new one. He needed it tonight. and he needed to tell Serafina that the careful architecture they had spent 22 days constructing had just been rendered partially obsolete by the speed at which their enemy was willing to move. He knocked on the door of the East Wing room an hour before midnight. She opened it immediately. She had not been sleeping. She was dressed, and her eyes were fully alert in the specific way of someone who had been waiting for the next development rather than resting between them. "Sit down," he said. "I need to tell you several things." She sat. He told her about Tom. He watched her face process it with the same focused attention she gave everything that required understanding, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment with the particular quality of quiet that meant she was revising her model of the situation. "Someone inside the keep," she said. "Was. Not anymore. But Voss knows the inside now. He knows the layout. He knows the watch patterns. Even the revised ones, because Tom would have provided them before—" "Yes." She looked at him. "We cannot wait for the ball." "No. If we move earlier, without the full preparation, the story we built has gaps. The timeline of the betrothal, the corroborating accounts, they need more time to be established." "I know. So we have a choice between two incomplete options. Move early with a story that has gaps, or wait for the ball with a position that Voss can strike at before we get there." "There is a third option," Cassian said. She waited. "We do not go to the ball at all. We go to the crown before the ball, directly. Not as a response to a summons, but as the initiating party. We arrive in the capital with Voss's letters and a formal accusation against a sitting council member, and we force the crown to respond to us, rather than the other way around." He paused. "It removes Voss's ability to set the terms of the encounter. It removes the ball as a venue where he can stage whatever he has planned for the public presentation, and it puts the documentation in royal hands before he has the opportunity to intercept it." She thought about it. He watched her think, the small hand gestures, the stillness in the center of it when she reached the load-bearing question. "It also removes every protection the planned timeline gave us," she said. "We arrive early, without the full household, without the social architecture we were going to build around the betrothal presentation. We arrive as two people with a stack of letters making accusations against a powerful man who has had 15 years to build his defenses at court. Yes, that is a significant risk. Everything from this point forward is a significant risk. The question is which risk gives us the most control over the outcome." She looked at him across the desk, across the letters and the maps and the 22 days of work between them, and he saw the moment she made the decision. Not with drama, with the clean, exact quality of someone who has run every available calculation and chosen. "When do we leave?" she said. 3 days. I need to send riders ahead. I need to prepare the documentation. And I need to deal with something in this keep before I leave it. Tom Hale, and whoever else Voss has reached that we have not yet found." He began gathering the letters from the desk, organizing them with the methodical precision that was the external expression of his mind at work. "I have operated on the assumption that my walls were sufficient. That isolation was equivalent to security. I built 15 years of control on the foundation of that assumption, and I was wrong about it, and the being wrong nearly cost—" He stopped. The sentence had an ending that he had not intended to approach. He felt it waiting on the other side of the stop. What the being wrong had nearly cost. And the ending was specific and carried a weight that did not belong inside the architecture of strategy and political survival, and he had no useful framework for it. He set the letters down. He looked at the window, the dark sea below the cliffs, the endless patient crashing of water against stone. "Go over the documentation tonight," he said. "Mark every gap in the timeline. By morning, I want a list of everything that needs to be addressed before we leave." "Cassian." He did not look at her. "It did not cost," she said quietly. "We are both here." The sentence was simple, and she had not dressed it up with anything, and it landed with the specific, undeflectable weight of plainly spoken truth. He stood with it for a moment, and the moment had the quality of something he could not catalog or file or store in the architecture of the 15 years. Could not make useful or operational or strategic, and he let it be what it was, briefly, before he rebuilt the structure. "Morning," he said. "The list by morning." He left. Behind him, in the East Wing room with the fires burning and the letters on the table and the knock of the sea against the cliffs below, Serafina Vale sat alone and looked at the door that had just closed, and in the silence of the room that had been cold and unused for 15 years, She felt the specific, complicated weight of having placed herself entirely inside the architecture of a man who did not know yet what he was building. The 3 days passed. The riders went south. On the morning of this fourth day, Cassian came to the east wing to tell Seraphina that the horses were ready and the documentation was prepared and that they would leave Blackthorne Keep within the hour for the capital. Edric met him at the corridor entrance. His face carried the expression that Cassian had seen twice in his life. Twice in 15 years. Both times it had preceded the worst information he had ever received. "There is a rider," Edric said, "from the capital. He arrived 20 minutes ago." "What does he carry?" Edric handed him a sealed document. Not a royal seal this time. A private one. A house seal that Cassian recognized because he had been looking at it for 15 years in the locked drawer of his oak desk, on documents he had never thrown away because he had told himself they were evidence and had never examined too closely the other reason he had kept them. The seal belonged to Lord Aldrich Hessler, the man Cassian had sent home in his underclothes 3 weeks ago. He broke it, read it. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph was an offer. The second paragraph was a threat. The third paragraph contained information that made both the offer and the threat irrelevant, because it contained the name of the man who had been feeding Voss intelligence about Cassian's movements and Cassian's household for the past 3 weeks, the man who had given Voss the intelligence to send those letters, to time that watch rotation, to know about Seraphina before the capital roads could have carried the news naturally. The name in the third paragraph was Edric Hale. Cassian read it again. The sea below the cliffs was audible through the stone. The fires in the east corridor were burning. Somewhere in the keep, Seraphina was preparing to leave, organizing the documentation they had built together across 22 days. He looked up from the letter. Edric was standing in the corridor 3 feet away, watching his face with the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has just understood that the carrying is over. The 30 years between them, the 3 generations of Raventhorns, the arrow pulled from the leg without flinching, the boy who had chased ravens across the northern moors. Everything that had been between them rose in the corridor and hung there for the span of a single breath, and then it was gone, replaced by the cold, flat assessment of a man looking at the full shape of a situation he had failed completely to see. "How long?" Cassian said. Edric did not look away. That was the thing. He did not look away. And in the not looking away was something that was not defiance and was not shame and was not the specific guilty collapse of a man caught in a lie. It was the face of a man who had already lived with his choice for long enough to have made his peace with it, which was in some ways worse than any of the alternatives. "Since the beginning," Edric said. "Since the beginning." 2 words, 3 syllables. The weight of 30 years compressed into a sentence that took less than a second to say and would take considerably longer to survive. Cassian did not move. He stood in the east corridor with Hessler's letter in his hand and the fires burning behind him, and the sea audible through the stone walls. And he held the full shape of what Edric had just told him. The way you hold something that has shattered, carefully, because the edges are sharp and the instinct to drop it is the most dangerous instinct available. 30 years. 3 generations. The boy chasing ravens across the northern moors. The arrow pulled from the leg. Every report, every strategic assessment, every piece of intelligence about Cassian's movements and decisions and vulnerabilities that Edric had been positioned to observe across 3 decades of absolute proximity. All of it, since the beginning. "Walk with me," Cassian said. Not because he needed to move, because standing still in this corridor with this information was the kind of thing that produced decisions made from the wrong place. And he had survived 15 years by understanding the difference between decisions made from clarity and decisions made from the part of the chest that did not think. Edric walked with him. They went to the study. The door closed. The morning light through the window was flat and gray and had no opinion about what was happening in the room. Cassian set Hessler's letter on the desk. He did not sit. He stood at the window with his back to Edric for a long moment, looking at the sea, giving the thing in his chest time to become something he could use rather than something that used him. "You were Voss's man before Voss was anyone worth being a man for," Cassian said, "which means you were not recruited. You were placed." "Yes." "By who?" A pause. The pause of a man deciding how much of 30 years to unpack in a single conversation. The council, the full Southern Council, before Voss consolidated his position within it. I was positioned here when your father was still alive. The arrangement transferred when your father died. A beat. When your father was killed. The word killed landed differently than it would have 3 minutes ago. Cassian turned from the window. You knew who killed him. Edric's face was the most terrible thing Cassian had ever seen on a human being, because it was not the face of a traitor performing remorse. It was the face of a man who had genuinely loved someone and genuinely betrayed them, and had carried both of those things in the same body for 30 years without resolution. I knew it was coming, Edric said. I did not know the night. I did not know the method. I was told to ensure the garrison was occupied. I occupied the garrison. His voice did not waver. It was the voice of a man giving a military report because that was the only register in which the words were survivable. I did not know about your mother until after. The study was very quiet. Cassian understood in that moment something that he had never fully understood before. Not intellectually, but in the specific physical way that the body understands things that the mind has been keeping at a managed distance. He understood what it felt like to have the floor of a certainty give way completely. Not gradually. All at once. The specific sensation of standing on something you believed was stone and discovering it was always something else. And the 30 years of your weight pressing down on it had not made it more solid, only deferred the moment of collapse. He had built everything on Edric, not just the garrison, not just the intelligence. The entire architecture of his survival after his father's death had been constructed around the presence of a man he had believed was the one fixed point in a world that had proven catastrophically unstable. He had not trusted easily or widely in 30 years. He had trusted Edric completely, and Edric had been the mechanism of his father's murder. He felt his hands, hanging at his sides, close into fists, not from rage, from the specific muscular response of a body that needs to grip something solid when everything solid has just been reclassified. Why are you telling me now? He said. His voice was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that was not calm, but the absence of everything except the most essential question. Because you were going to find out when you reached the capital, Edric said. Hessler's letter was not the first copy sent. Voss has a copy. He has had one for 10 days. He was going to use it at the winter ball to destroy your position before you could deploy the letters against him. Remove your credibility, remove your captain, remove every account of the events of the last month by establishing that your household intelligence was compromised from the beginning. He paused. I chose to tell you first. That is not mercy. That is strategy. Yes, Edric said. It is both. Cassian looked at him for a long time. The 30 years sat between them. The boy on the moors. The arrow. The mornings in this study, the reports, the silences, the specific trusted shorthand of two people who had shared a world for long enough to stop explaining themselves to each other. All of it real, all of it contaminated, both things simultaneously true, and he had no framework for carrying them in the same hands. Get out of this keep, Cassian said, before I decide what you are worth to me as leverage against Voss versus what it costs me to let you leave. Edric stood for a moment. He looked at Cassian with the face of a man who has said what he came to say and has no remaining claim on anything except the doorway. She is the first thing in 15 years that has made you worth fighting for, Edric said. I'm telling you that because you will not see it yourself until you are standing in a burning room deciding whether the price is acceptable. He left. Cassian stood in the study alone for 6 minutes. Then he picked up Hessler's letter, put it with Voss's documentation, picked up everything on the desk that mattered, and went to find Serafina. She read Hessler's letter in 2 minutes. She read it and set it down and looked at the wall and did the thing she did when she was processing a revision to a structural assumption, the brief stillness at the center of visible thought. Voss already has this information, she said. Yes. Then the capital strategy is dead. We cannot arrive with a documentation package and an accusation if he has already established that your household captain was his operative. He destroys the frame before we can put the picture in it. Yes, she looked at him. He was standing in the center of the East Wing room where he had stood dozens of times in the past weeks, but something in the quality of his stillness was different today, and she read it with the accuracy she brought to reading everything about him. How are you? she said. Functional? That is not what I asked. He looked at her for a moment with the specific expression he used when she asked questions that operated outside the boundaries he had established for the conversation. Then something in it shifted, not softened, not opened, but adjusted, the way a locked door adjusts when the key is finally the right one. We need a new strategy, he said, and we need it in the next 4 hours. She accepted the redirect, not because she was finished with the other conversation, but because she understood that this was the way he moved through damage, and that pushing him before he was ready would only close doors that were beginning to open. They worked. The 4 hours were the most concentrated work they had done across the entire 22 days, because the timeline had collapsed entirely, and what remained was not a plan, but the bones of one, and they built around the bones with everything available. The revised approach was simpler and more dangerous than anything they had attempted before. No managed arrival. No careful presentation at the ball. They would go to the one person at court who had the standing to receive Voss's documentation outside the council's visibility and the motivation to use it, Lord Chancellor Aldrich Brennan, who was not the same Aldrich as Hessler, but who had been in active conflict with Voss's council faction for 6 years over the Eastern trade route taxation, and who would recognize the letters for what they were and what they were worth. It required reaching the Chancellor before Voss could intercept. It required moving in 2 days rather than 3. And it required Cassian arriving at the capital without the protective structure of a full household narrative, which meant arriving exposed in ways that the ball strategy had been specifically designed to prevent. There is one more problem, Serafina said, at the end of the 4 hours, looking at what they had built. Tell me, if Edric's access went as deep as Hessler's letter suggests, Voss knows we are planning to move. He has known for days. He is not going to wait for us to reach the Chancellor. She looked at him. He is going to come here, before we leave, with more than 6 men this time. The silence that followed was operational. Cassian ran it, the numbers, the road time from the capital, the resources Voss had demonstrated the willingness to deploy, the window between now and movement. Tonight, Cassian said. Tonight, she agreed. He had the garrison doubled on every entrance within the hour. Not Edric's garrison, the men Edric had commanded and shaped and positioned. The younger soldiers, the ones who had been with the keep for less than 3 years, who could not have been placed with the same long-term architecture. He briefed them himself, directly, without intermediary, which was not how he had operated for 15 years, but which was the only viable option when the intermediary had been the compromise. He spent the afternoon in the armory, not reviewing it, working in it. The specific physical occupation of a man who needs his hands to be doing something concrete while his mind processes the immaterial. He sharpened 3 blades that did not need sharpening and checked the integrity of armor. He could have assessed blindfolded and did not examine why he was doing it, except that the motion was useful, and useful was what he had. Serafina found him there at dusk. She stood in the armory doorway and looked at him working, and she did not say anything for a moment, and the silence was the kind she had learned to read, the kind that meant she was deciding not whether to speak, but how. I need you to understand something, she said. He set down the blade, looked at her. I came here with a forged document and a plan that was entirely self-serving, she said. Everything I proposed was designed around my survival. I want you to know I understand that, and I understand what it cost you to extend what you extended, especially given— She stopped. Started again. What Edric did does not erase 30 years of what was real. Both things are true. I know you know that. I am saying it because you are standing in an armory at dusk sharpening blades that do not need sharpening, and someone should say it out loud. He was very still. You are not as alone as you have built yourself to be, she said. That is not a comfort. It is a tactical reality. Use it. She left the armory doorway. He stood in the silence she left behind, and the thing beneath the architecture was present again, undeniable and clarifying, and he stood with it and did not turn away from it this time. For the first time in 15 years, he let a thing exist in his chest without immediately finding a use for it or a place to store it where it would not interfere. It interfered, completely, and he let it. They came at midnight, not 6 men. 30. They came through 3 separate entrances simultaneously, which required inside coordination that Edric had provided before he left. The last useful act of 30 years of positioned service. They came with torches, and they came with the specific organized efficiency of a private force that had been briefed on the layout of the structure they were entering. Cassian was already in the main corridor when the east gate breach alarm sounded, because he had been awake and positioned since sundown. Because the conclusion that they were coming tonight had not been a guess, but a calculation he trusted with his life. He had 14 garrison soldiers he was confident in, against 30 men who knew the layout. The math was not in his favor. He had survived worse math before. The next 40 minutes were the kind of 40 minutes that could not be prepared for, even when you had prepared for them. The keep became a series of contained engagements, corridor by corridor, room by room, each one its own complete and brutal equation. Cassian moved through it with the same economical violence he had demonstrated in the East Corridor 2 weeks earlier, but multiplied, extended, the cumulative cost of it registering in the body. The way cumulative cost registered in the jaw that had been hit twice and was screaming, in the shoulder that had taken a blade across the surface and was bleeding through the coat, in the lungs that had stopped asking for adequate time to recover between efforts. He was not thinking about the pain. Pain was data. Data informed decision-making and then was filed. What he was thinking about, in the narrow operational bandwidth that violence left available for thought, was the thing Edric had said in the study. She is the first thing in 15 years that has made you worth fighting for. He had classified that as manipulation at the time, the last card of a man with nothing left to play. He was revising that classification in real time between the third and fourth corridor engagements, in the brief pause where his back was against the stone wall, and he was listening for the next approach, and his shoulder was telling him things he was not interested in hearing. The revision was this. Edric had been a traitor. Edric had also, genuinely, known him better than anyone alive. Both things were true. And the true part, the knowing, had produced an observation that the false part, the allegiance, did not invalidate. He had been worth fighting for before she arrived. He had fought continuously for 15 years. But he had been fighting to maintain a static position, to keep the walls where they were, to preserve the exact shape of the world as it had been on the night before everything ended, frozen in amber, defended with everything he had. That was not fighting for something. That was refusing to lose something already lost. She had walked into his great hall with a forged decree and the specific audacity of someone with nothing left to protect, and she had shown him, without intending to, what it looked like to fight forward instead of still. He pushed off the wall, moved into the next corridor. The south passage was where they had concentrated. 8 men pushing toward the east wing, which was where the documents were, which was where Serafina was. Voss's priorities had not changed. The letters were the objective. She was the mechanism for accessing them. Whatever else Voss wanted, he wanted those documents in his hands, and he wanted them there tonight before Cassian could reach the Chancellor. Cassian hit the south passage from the eastern approach, and the engagement that followed was the most costly of the night. He took a hit across the ribs that folded him for a moment, the specific sensation of something possibly cracked and definitely screaming, and he came up from the fold and drove forward because the alternative was to stop, and stopping was not available. 4 men went down. 3 scattered. 1 stood his ground, and the one who stood his ground was good, genuinely good, the kind of opponent who required actual attention rather than the reduced attention that the night's previous engagements had required. They worked across each other for 40 seconds that felt longer, and Cassian took a cut across the left forearm that added to the accounting and finished it with a decision made from desperation and physics rather than technique. He stood in the south passage breathing. The ribs were telling him their opinion. He was not interested in their opinion. He heard Serafina's voice from behind the east wing door, not screaming, talking, low and deliberate, and with the specific controlled quality of someone managing a dangerous situation through words, because the physical options had been exhausted. He reached the door. Inside, 2 men, 1 holding Serafina, 1 standing over the overturned table where the documents had been stored, holding the packet of letters, Voss's letters, the 3 documents that were the entire leverage point of everything they had built. And beside the man with the letters, not holding a weapon, not in the employ of Voss's private force, standing in the East Wing room with the expression of a man who had made every calculation available to him and chosen the one that served his own survival above everything else. Lord Aldrich Hessler, not an ally, not a source of intelligence about Voss, Not the author of a letter warning Cassian about Edric's betrayal out of some residual decency. The man who had ridden in his underclothes back to the southern capital and made a different arrangement. A direct one. The letters in exchange for a position in Voss's hierarchy. Hessler's letter had not been a warning. It had been a distraction. A mechanism to ensure Cassian was occupied processing Edric's betrayal, while Hessler came through a third entrance that the garrison, focused on the main assault, had left unaddressed. Cassian stood in the doorway with blood on his coat, and the ribs making their case and the left arm contributing its own commentary, and he looked at Hessler across the east wing room. And Hessler looked back at him with the expression of a man who has just realized that the calculation he made was correct, but the variable he failed to account for was that Cassian Raventhorne had arrived at this room anyway. Serafina looked at Cassian from across the room. The trust was there again, exact and unadorned, the thing that had no strategic classification and no useful operational framework, and which had been, since the moment he first saw it, the most dangerous and the most necessary thing anyone had offered him in 15 years. Hessler held the letters up. "I walk out of this keep with these," he said, "and you keep the woman. Voss gets what he needs. This ends without further—" "Put them down," Cassian said. "You are in no position to—" "I am in the only position that matters." He took one step into the room, and the step cost him something in the ribs that he did not show. "You came into my house. You put hands on someone under my protection. You are standing in a room that belongs to me, holding documents that belong to me, making offers that presuppose I have something left to lose by refusing them." His voice had gone to the place it went in the courtyard, in the corridor, in every moment across 30 years when the cost of being what he was had become most visible. "You have miscounted what I value." Again, Hessler's hand tightened on the letters. The man holding Serafina pulled her back a step. And Cassian Raventhorne, bleeding from 3 separate wounds, ribs announcing a structural complaint, 30 years of the only certainty he had possessed, revealed as a fabrication, stood in the doorway of the East Wing room and made the last calculation available to him. Not the strategic calculation, not the political one. The only one that, in this moment, in this room, with this woman's eyes on him carrying that specific and devastating trust, was actually true. He had nothing left to lose, which meant he had nothing left to hold back. He moved. He moved the way a man moves when there is nothing left to calculate. Not reckless. The opposite of reckless. When the last protection strips away, when everything that was held in reserve against the possibility of future need becomes irrelevant because the future has collapsed into this single room, this single moment, the body achieves a terrible clarity. Every motion exact. Every decision arrived at before consciousness catches up with it. Cassian Raventhorne crossed the East Wing room with 3 open wounds and cracked ribs and 30 years of accumulated damage, and he moved like something that had been waiting its entire life to stop holding back. The man holding Serafina made the mistake of watching Cassian instead of managing his grip. She used the half-second his attention shifted to drive her elbow backward into his solar plexus with the precise, economical force of someone who had thought carefully about exactly this scenario in the days since the first attempted breach. The grip broke. She dropped and moved sideways toward the wall in a single motion, clearing the room's center, and Cassian was already past her. Hessler scrambled backward. He was not a fighting man. He was a political man, a man of leverage and alliance and carefully positioned advantage, and he had spent his entire career ensuring that when violence became necessary, someone else performed it. The man beside him with the letters reached for his blade, and Cassian took the blade hand at the wrist and applied the same rotation he had used in the corridor 2 weeks ago on a different man in a different crisis that now felt like a rehearsal for this one, and the blade hit the floor, and then its owner followed it. Hessler was against the far wall. The letters were still in his hand, clutched against his chest with the specific desperation of a man who understands that the thing he is holding is the only remaining currency he possesses. Cassian stopped 3 feet from him. His breathing was controlled through effort rather than ease. The ribs were providing continuous commentary that he was continuously ignoring. The cut across his left forearm had soaked through to his sleeve and was making itself known with the patient insistence of damage that is decided to be noticed regardless of the host's preferences. He held out his hand. Hessler looked at the hand, looked at Cassian's face. He was a man who had spent 40 years reading rooms, reading people, assessing the arithmetic of a situation and identifying the available exits. He read this room now and found no exits. What he found instead, in Cassian's face, was something he had not encountered in 4 decades of political navigation. A man who had already paid the price and was still standing. Hessler held out the letters. His hand was shaking in a way he could not control. Cassian took them without a word, and in the taking there was no triumph, no satisfaction, nothing that resembled the performance of victory. Just the return of something that should not have been taken, the correction of an error. "Sit down," Cassian said. Hessler sat on the floor against the wall because there was nothing else available, and in the sitting was the complete and final collapse of everything he had ridden into Blackthorne Keep, believing about himself and his position and the relative weight of his choices. Cassian turned to Serafina. She was standing against the side wall, watching him with the focused attention she gave everything. But underneath the focus was the specific quality of a person who has been running for so long that the sudden absence of immediate threat produces something close to vertigo. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was not quite. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." A pause. "You are." Later. She looked at him for a moment with the expression she had when she was deciding not to push, which was an expression he had come to recognize as one of the more significant decisions a person could make. "All right," she said. "Later." He bound Hessler's wrists with his own belt and left him sitting in the East Wing room with 2 unconscious men for company and no access to anything that mattered, and he went to find what remained of his garrison. The keep was quiet in the way of spaces that have recently contained violence and have not yet returned to their ordinary nature. The torches that Voss's men had carried were mostly extinguished now, either by the garrison or by their natural duration, and Blackthorne moved through its own corridors lit by the iron chandeliers and the fires in the grates, familiar and permanent and entirely indifferent to the events of the past 2 hours. Stone did not record what happened against it. That was both its limitation and its grace. 11 of his 14 soldiers were functional. 2 were injured in ways that required attention. 1 was dead, a young soldier named Pell, who had been with the keep for 8 months, and who had held the East Gate breach point alone for 4 minutes to give the garrison time to respond. Cassian stood over him in the east courtyard for a moment longer than the operational situation required. He had not stood over the dead in a long time. He had developed, over 15 years, the specific discipline of moving past loss without lingering, because lingering was how grief accumulated mass and mass, was how grief became a structural feature of a person rather than an event they passed through. He had made himself efficient at loss. He had been proud of the efficiency. Standing over Pell, 23 years old, 8 months in the garrison, holding the gate, he felt the efficiency for what it actually was. Not strength, not discipline. The practiced avoidance of a man who had decided at 14 that the cost of feeling things fully was higher than he was willing to pay, and then had paid the cost of not feeling them instead, in the specific accumulated currency of isolation and amber, and 15 years of standing in a frozen world and calling it control. He stayed a moment longer. He let Pell's death be what it was, a real thing that had happened to a real person, without filing it or reducing it or storing it somewhere that kept it from pressing against the places that were already pressed. Then he went to do what needed to be done. Masum. The night's accounting took 3 hours. The garrison secured every unconscious and captured man from Voss's force and confined them in the lower level. Cassian sent the fastest rider available toward the capital before dawn with a sealed document addressed to Lord Chancellor Aldrich Brennan, containing not just Voss's letters, but a full account of the night's events, Hessler's role, the nature of the operation, and every piece of documentation that Serafina and Cassian had assembled across 22 days of careful construction. He sent a second rider to a different address, a man who owed Cassian a significant debt from a territorial negotiation 3 years prior, and who now sat on the Eastern Judiciary. Insurance, the way he had always operated, multiple pressure points, multiple contingencies. But this time there was a difference. This time the documentation told a true story. Not a managed one, not a strategically framed one, but the actual sequence of events as they had happened. He had spent 15 years controlling the narrative of Blackthorne Keep, shaping what the outside world understood about his power and his position. He had been very good at it. He was sending a true account now, not because truth was tactically superior, though it was, but because the alternative required him to continue being something he had decided, somewhere in the past 40 minutes, he was no longer willing to be. The sun came up over the northern cliffs with the indifference of all northern suns, gray and diffuse and committed to nothing. Cassian was in the study when the light changed. He had been sitting at the desk for an hour, not working, not planning, doing the thing he had not done at this desk in 15 years. Sitting still with nothing in his hands. The ribs had been bound by the garrison's attending soldier, who had also cleaned and stitched the forearm cut with the brisk professionalism of someone who had learned to work on patients who did not want to be worked on. The jaw would bruise deeply and had likely been fractured previously, and fractured again tonight, and was communicating its displeasure at considerable volume. He sat with the displeasure and did not move to silence it. He was thinking about his father, not the portrait, not the sealed corridor, not the managed, archived version of the man that Cassian had maintained at the precise distance where memory could not damage anything structural. He was thinking about the actual man, the negotiations conducted with a hunting knife in hand, not because he was threatening anyone, but because he had a restlessness that needed occupation. The way he had laughed when the ravens landed, a full and undignified sound completely inconsistent with the architecture of his title. The way he had told Cassian once, when Cassian was perhaps 11 years old, that the most dangerous thing a powerful man could do was confuse the strength required to hold what he had with the strength required to be what he was. Cassian had not understood it at 11. He had not understood it at 14 when the world ended. He had not understood it at 30 when he had rebuilt the world into something he could control. He understood it now, at 34, sitting in a study with bound ribs and a dead soldier in his courtyard, and 30 years of misplaced trust catalogued and filed, and a woman in the East Wing who had walked through his gate with a forged decree and no remaining options and shown him, without intending to and without performance, what it looked like to be genuinely alive. The door of the study opened. Serafina came in without knocking. She had never knocked after the first week. She carried 2 cups of something that steamed, set one on the desk in front of him, and sat down in the chair across the desk that she had occupied across 22 days of strategy sessions and arguments, and the slow, incremental construction of something neither of them had named. She looked at him. He looked at her. The morning light was in the window, and it was the same gray as every morning light in the north, and neither of them spoke for a moment. And the silence was not a contest and was not a weapon and was not the careful management of 2 people navigating something they could not fully classify. It was just 2 people sitting in the same room with the same weight and neither of them pretending otherwise. Pell held the east gate, Cassian said. I know, Garrison told me. She wrapped her hands around her cup. He was 23. 8 months in the keep. She did not offer comfort. She did not reach for the words that people reach for when the alternative is sitting with someone inside something that does not resolve into anything useful. She sat with him inside it, which was the thing she had been doing from the beginning, he understood now. Not managing him, not navigating him, just being present in the places where his architecture had gaps, without demanding that he acknowledge the gaps or explain them or perform gratitude for the company. Voss will be addressed, he said. The documentation is on its way to Brennan, the full account, every piece. I know, I saw the writers leave. It will take 3 weeks to move through the Chancellor's process, possibly 4. Voss has defenses inside the Council that will need to be dismantled before the formal charge is actionable. Yes, the ball is in 36 days. We will likely be called to present testimony in person. Yes, he looked at her across the desk. Across the cups of something hot, and the morning light, and the 22 days of work, and the corridor and the portrait, and the East Wing room and the trust that had no strategic classification. I'm going to need you to stay, he said. It was not the speech he had prepared at no point in his life. It did not have the architecture of a declaration or the structure of a proposition. It was the simplest available version of a truth that had been building in the bones of the past 3 weeks, stripped of everything except the essential. Because he had spent the night learning what happened when you carried too much in reserve and what it cost, and he was done paying that particular cost. She looked at him with the expression that was not quite a smile but occupied the same territory, the one he had seen for the first time in the Great Hall and had been cataloging ever since without admitting to himself what it was he was collecting. I was not planning to leave, she said. I know. I am saying it anyway. Why? He turned the cup in his hands. Because I have spent 15 years building a world where nothing I did required saying out loud, where everything could be maintained through implication and position and the management of what other people understood. Because saying things directly meant they were real, and real things could be lost. He paused. The pause had the quality of something being set down after a long time of being carried. I am done with that particular architecture. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice had the texture of someone who has also been carrying something that was beginning to be too heavy. I came here to use you, she said. That was true. The forged decree, the calculation, all of it. I want you to know I know that. And I know what it cost you to extend what you extended to someone whose first move was manipulation. You came here because you had nothing left and you needed to survive, he said. I understand that motivation better than most. That does not make the manipulation honest. No. He looked at her. It makes you human, which is a thing I had stopped accounting for in my assessments of people. He paused. In my assessments of myself. The morning light moved through the window, shifted by clouds the way northern light shifted, without drama, just the continuous slow revision of what was visible. Outside, the sea maintained its argument with the cliffs. Blackthorne Keep held the sounds it had always held, stone and wind and the low-frequency permanence of a structure that had stood through everything the North had produced for 200 years. But something in the quality of those sounds had changed, or something in the way Cassian was hearing them had changed, which amounted to the same thing. He thought about what it had cost to become what he was, the systematic removal of every softness, the decision, made at 14 and reinforced every year since, that the only way to survive the specific brutality of the world he inhabited was to be more brutal than it. He had been right about that at 14, in the immediate aftermath of catastrophe. It had been the correct survival mechanism for the situation he had been in. The problem was that survival mechanisms, if left unexamined, became identities. And identities built from the requirements of a crisis did not automatically dissolve when the crisis passed. They persisted. They shaped everything. They became the only self available, and then you looked up one day and found that you had been managing a static position for 15 years, defending the exact shape of the world as it had been on the worst night of your life, and calling it strength. Seraphina had not walked into Blackthorne Keep with a plan to change him. She had walked in with a forged decree and a survival instinct and the specific, accidental courage of someone who has nothing left to be afraid of losing. What had changed him was not her intention. It was her presence, the way she had occupied his spaces without apology, challenged his frameworks without performance, and looked at the portrait of his father in a sealed corridor and said the true thing instead of the safe one. You learned not to expect that. It cost you something. It had cost him everything, and it had been worth every piece of it. And sitting at the desk in the gray morning light with the cracked ribs and the bound arm and the dead soldier in the courtyard, and the 30 years of misclassified evidence of a life lived at the wrong distance from itself. He understood something that his father had tried to tell him at 11 years old. The strength required to hold what you have and the strength required to be what you are. Two different things. He had mastered the first and avoided the second for 15 years. He was done avoiding. The winter ball, he said. We will be required to appear. Yes. As my household. She held his gaze. Yes. The story we built has gaps. Voss's people know it. The council investigators will find them. They will, she agreed. Which means when we stand before the court, the betrothal account will not hold under serious examination. He set his cup down. I'm not going to ask you to stand in front of the kingdom's court on the foundation of a story that can be pulled apart. Not after everything that has been asked of you in this keep. She was very still. What are you saying? I am saying that the forged decree was a beginning and it served its purpose, and I am not interested in building what comes next on something manufactured. He looked at her across the desk with the specific directness of a man who has decided that the cost of indirection is higher than the cost of exposure. I am asking you if you want to make the true version, not the strategic version, not the version that protects a political position, the one where you walked through my gate and we built something across 22 days that neither of us planned and both of us know is real. The silence that followed was the longest one that had existed between them. and it had a quality entirely unlike every other silence they had shared. It was not a contest. It was not a gap being managed. It was the sound of something being considered with the full weight it deserved, by a person who had learned through hard and specific experience not to make decisions from anything other than the clearest available truth. "That is a considerable thing to ask," she said. "Yes. We have known each other for 22 days. 23, he said. "And I have known you better in 23 days than I have known anyone in 30 years. That is not a romantic claim. It is an accurate one." She looked at him for a long moment. In her eyes he could see the full architecture of what she was weighing, the risk and the cost and the specific hard-earned wariness of a woman who had watched manipulation dressed as honesty destroy her father's life and had spent years since learning to identify the seam where performance ended and reality began. She was looking for the seam in him now. He held still under the examination and did not construct a defense against it, because he was done constructing defenses against things that deserved a clear line of sight. She found what she was looking for, or did not find what she was afraid of. Either way, something settled in her face, something that had been held at managed tension released, not entirely, not in the way of a person abandoning wariness, but in the way of a person deciding that the ground they are standing on will hold. "All right," she said. 2 words, 3 syllables. The precise weight of 30 years carried differently. What? Spring came late to the Northern Territories, as it always had, with the specific stubbornness of seasons that had been shaped by geography rather than expectation. It came in increments, each one earned rather than given. The snow retreated from the cliff faces by degrees. The sea changed color over the course of weeks, moving from iron gray toward something that contained, on the right days, the distant suggestion of blue. The ravens came back to the moors in numbers that Cassian had not seen since childhood, and on a morning in early April, he stood at the east tower window and watched them move across the pale sky and felt something he had no existing category for and did not attempt to create one. It was enough. It was simply enough. The ravens and the lightning sky and the sound of the keep behind him, which contained these days the sounds of a household that functioned as a living thing rather than a preserved one. Lord Chancellor Brennan had moved with the speed of a man who had been waiting 7 years for adequate documentation. Voss's removal from the council had been completed in 6 weeks, his financial operations audited, his territorial interests seized by the Crown pending full investigation. 3 of the 4 men who had participated in Marcus Vale's estate manipulation were now facing formal inquiry. The 4th, the court clerk Voss had elevated, had demonstrated the survival instinct of the professionally pragmatic, and had provided testimony that accelerated the entire proceeding considerably. Hessler had been confined to his own estate, stripped of his council privileges, and left to the specific, lingering punishment of irrelevance, which Cassian had determined was more precise than anything the formal system would have provided. A man like Hessler required an audience to function. Without one, he diminished into himself with the natural efficiency of a machine deprived of its fuel. The winter ball had come and gone. They had stood before the court in the great hall of the Capitol, and the story they had told was the true one. And the true one had contained all the gaps that a manufactured account would not have contained, and it had been believed with a conviction that no crafted narrative could have produced, because the people in that room, for all their political sophistication, could still recognize the particular unmanageable texture of something real. Cassian had worn no armor at the ball. He had stood beside Seraphina in the center of the court's full attention, and he had not arranged his face into the geometry of intimidation that he had maintained for 15 years in every public-facing situation. He had not needed to. Something had shifted in the weeks since the night of the East Wing room, in the way he occupied space, in the specific quality of stillness he carried, and the court had read it with the accuracy that courts read the people who walk through them, and what they had read was not softness. It was the stillness of a man who had stopped defending a position and started inhabiting one. The signet ring had been placed in Seraphina's hand not at the ball, but 3 days before it, in the East Tower study, in the flat gray morning light with no audience and no theater. He had set it in her palm and closed her fingers over it and said nothing, because some things did not require language to carry their full weight. And she had looked at it in her closed hand and then at him with the face that was not quite a smile and occupied its own territory, and that had been sufficient. On a morning in April, with the ravens on the moors and the sea beginning to consider the possibility of blue, Serafina came to stand beside him at the east tower window. She carried coffee. She had developed the habit of appearing at this window in the early mornings, not always with conversation, sometimes just with coffee, and the particular ease of a person who had made a decision about where they belonged and had stopped auditing the decision. She stood beside him and looked at the ravens and said nothing for a while. "Edric sent a letter," she said eventually. Cassian had known this was coming. He had been carrying the weight of it since the garrison runner had brought the sealed document 3 days ago, which was still sitting in the locked desk drawer, unread. "I know. Are you going to read it?" He looked at the ravens crossing the pale sky, 20 or 30 of them, moving in that loose collective way that was not quite formation and not quite chaos, some middle state that had its own intelligence. He thought about a boy running across the northern moors with the specific uncalculated joy of a person who had not yet learned to calculate. He thought about 30 years of service, genuine and contaminated, both things real, both things true, neither one canceling the other. He thought about what his father had been trying to tell him at 11 years old, about the two different kinds of strength and how one of them required something the other did not. Required the willingness to remain open to things that could damage you, specifically because the alternative was to stop being the kind of person capable of being damaged, which was another way of saying the kind of person capable of being alive. He had been the second kind for 15 years. He was choosing, consciously and with full knowledge of the cost, to be the first kind again. "Yes," he said. "Later." Later was not avoidance. Later meant when he was ready to sit with whatever Edric had written and let it be what it was without managing his response to it in advance. The distinction was small, insignificant, and he understood it in a way that would have been inaccessible to him 3 months ago. Serafina nodded. She looked back at the ravens. The coffee steamed between her hands in the cold morning air. "The northern moors look different in the spring," she said. "They do. You should take me out there, when the ground solidifies enough." He looked at her profile against the morning light, the specific quality of a face that had been exhausted and afraid and determined and calculating and genuine, sometimes all in the same conversation, and which now carried the expression of a person who had found solid ground and was standing on it without performance. "I will," he said. He turned back to the window. Below the cliffs, the sea was doing what it had always done, throwing itself against the stone with its particular patient endlessness. He had watched it for 15 years and called it stubbornness. He understood now that it was something else. Not the refusal to accept defeat, the refusal to stop moving. The understanding, built into the nature of water itself, that the rock was not the enemy. The rock was simply what you had to move through to become what you were becoming. Blackthorne Keep held the morning around them. The fires were burning in the east wing, had been burning every night for 3 months. The ravens crossed the sky in their loose and purposeful intelligence. Somewhere below in the great hall, the garrison was running its first rotation of the day, and the new captain, a steady soldier named Oren, who had held a corridor breach point alone for 8 minutes on the night of Voss's assault, was issuing the morning's orders with the specific competence of someone who had been trusted completely and intended to remain worthy of it. The kingdom still knew the name Raventhorne, still said it the way people said the names of things they did not want to encounter directly. That had not changed. But in the places that mattered, in the rooms where the actual work of living was conducted, in the east wing with its burning fires, and the study with its unlocked drawer, and the west corridor with its unshuttered windows where the portrait hung in the morning light without apology, something had changed that all the political accounting in the south could not quantify. Duke Cassian Raventhorne had come home from a war he had been fighting alone inside his own walls, and he had brought someone back with him, and the carrying had not diminished him. It had been the first thing in 30 years that had not. The ravens settled on the northern moors as the morning light strengthened. The sea made its argument against the stone. Beside him at the window, Duchess Serafina Raventhorne drank her coffee in the cold air of a northern spring and did not fill the silence with anything, because the silence did not need filling, and she had always known the difference.